Alright, so I haven't actually done a video in a couple weeks. I haven't really known what to talk about, but seeing as how it's almost Halloween, and 13's kind of a superstitious number, and it's been 13 years since I started using Linux, I thought I'd make a video. And right off the bat, you might notice some differences from my last video, in that I've moved the panel to the top, and my button layout is a little different. So on the left here, I have the X, and then I have close window here, and minimize, maximize here. That's not close. This is close window. I never understood what this is called. I know this is minimize, maximize. You're not closing the window. You're putting it to the panel. I don't fucking know. So this is still Linux Mint, but I'm running Debian edition here, and as you can see, I've switched my icon pack to Papyrus, and then I have this over here. I have my date and time right next to the weather, and if we go to Control-Alt-T and we do neo fetch, see we're running Linux Mint Debian edition 4. We're kernel 5.8.7. So I am running Linux Mint Debian edition 4. I have the MX Linux repositories added, and I'm running an Ubuntu kernel. So it's kind of Frankensteined, but it's very stable. And while I do like some of the things Ubuntu does in additional to hardware, I don't like the direction they've taken with, the Amazon thing where if you search through your desktop, you are searching through Amazon. There was the most recent thing they're doing with snaps. I never liked snaps. I think they suck. And them being proprietary is just terrible in nature. Not because proprietary software is necessarily evil, in my opinion. I don't like the idea of installing free and open source packages through a proprietary app store. There's just something about that I don't like. But even worse is the Ubuntu kernel update utility, which was done by someone else who wasn't affiliated with Ubuntu, who now apparently wasn't making enough money, so he's made that proprietary. So to update your kernel, you have to use proprietary software. That's something else I'm not into anymore. So Ubuntu's just gone to shit, and I just switched from regular Linux Mint to the Debian edition. MX Linux, of course, is also based off Debian, but I started using Linux when Vista came out, and I had just jumped into the deep end and switched to Linux, Debian Linux, which was 4.0, which was, off the top of my head, it was Etch, I think. I think it was Etch. And, there's a lot of things I haven't learned, really, because I really never needed to. And that's kind of on me, because, coming from Windows, using Windows 95, 98, ME, XP, all I ever really needed a computer back then when I was a kid was to look things up on the internet, maybe play a couple games here and there, type a Word document. So when I started using Linux, that's what I used it for. I didn't really need to learn anything else with a computer. To this day, I don't know how to type properly because I never learned how to type properly. I know how to use a keyboard, I just don't know how to type, like you see the people do with their fingers moving really quickly, and they're typing like 300 words a minute. I can't do that for shit. I'm a very slow typer because I never learned properly. With Linux, the only thing I really don't know how to do is install tar files. That's one thing I never got really into. And I should probably learn, but other shit takes priority. And with Debian in particular, the one thing I never really learned how to do was how to update the kernel. With Ubuntu, it's much easier. I can just install it into a file in my downloads, a folder in my downloads called Kernel. Command into that, so cd downloads kernel, and then install it that way, because they're just deb packages. And Debian is really what I know the most because it's what I've used the longest. But the reason why I don't really use Debian anymore is because it's just out of date, and it's just not really good for what I needed it to anymore. And I noticed that a couple years ago, which is when I started distro hopping. And I ended up settling on Linux Mint because, you know, it's based off Ubuntu, it's based off Debian, but it is much more modern and much more user-friendly. And no, I'm not a noob, but there are some things I don't know how to do, but I much prefer to do things in a GUI than through a command line. I'm just lazy. That's kind of my problem. I'm fucking lazy. And, like, even nowadays, like, if I install Debian, the Wi-Fi and shit doesn't work because the kernel's just out of date. But Debian is a good base to base any distro off of, in my opinion. A lot of distros are based off Debian, and for good reason. Even, you know, things based off Ubuntu, like Mint, not this type of Mint, the regular Mint, or Pop! OS are based off Ubuntu. Ubuntu is based off Debian. So Debian does get integrated in a lot of things. The only other Linux distros I've ever used is OpenSUSE and Red Hat and Fedora. I've never used Arch, and for good reason. I've tried using Manjaro. It's a pain in the ass to even install properly. Anytime I try to make a USB stick, the file system doesn't exist and it won't boot into it, so I can't even try it. But also the package manager is just too different for me. For example, if I wanted to install a package on something Debian based, I'd do sudo. It used to be apt-get. Nowadays you don't have to type the -get, you can just write sudo apt and then you do install. Now on Red Hat, OpenSUSE, or Fedora, you can do sudo yum install. Doesn't need to be two space there. So it's very easy to transition from what Debian uses to what Red Hat and OpenSUSE uses. Of course, with Red Hat, you can also do sudo dnf, but still, it's very easy to transition into those distros. The Pacman, or whatever the fuck it's called in Arch, is just too different. It requires a whole new mindset of how to install shit, and I just don't have the time to or patience to learn it. That's on me, I'm well aware. I do like the theming of Linux Mint, and Cinnamon is my favorite desktop environment I've found so far. It's everything GNOME should be. I'm old enough and I've used Linux long enough to remember when GNOME looked like Windows, and then GNOME 3 came out, and it just seems the latest versions of GNOME just keep taking shit out, so you have to add it back to get any functionality, and it's kind of a pain in the ass. And I don't really like it. So this is the one I'm using. But what's really cool about, you can see here what their goal is. But what's really cool about Cinnamon is, if we go into settings here, I think it's Windows. I have the button layouts to classic Mac because I wanted something different. I've been using the Windows layout pretty much all my life, and I'm kind of getting bored of it, so I decided, you know what, let's try something new. Now, that's not to say I'm going to start using a Mac keyboard anytime soon. I might try it in the future, but I'm not looking to, just change everything to Mac style. I very much know how to use a Windows keyboard more than anything. So I'll probably stick with that. Plus, I'm not about to go out and buy a fucking MacBook to install Linux on anytime soon. But I do like the classic Mac layout, even though I've never used a Macintosh that old. And that's kind of one of the things I like about Linux, is you can truly customize it. As you can see, I have the theme set to a very dark theme. Min-X dark, Min-Y dark, sorry, Papyrus dark. I have the folders changed, darker gray, so I have gray buttons. This is dark, but the windows are light. To change the colors of the folders, you want, I think it's Papyrus folders. That's it. So as you can see, you can change the folder color to pretty much anything. I have it set to black, so it's a nice dark theme. And if I go into files, as you can see, they're all black. The Tor browser doesn't install properly because, tar file and whatnot. And it's just a pain in the ass. But overall, the only other thing I did was fonts. As you can see, I changed everything to Comic Sans. So all this is Comic Sans. Because I have the Microsoft font package installed. And Microsoft did make good fonts. I've always liked Comic Sans, so that's cool. So I kind of have like a cartoony dark theme going on with Papyrus and Comic Sans. And that's actually pretty cool. But in the 13 years I've used Linux, I've noticed, and I noticed this back when I switched, Vista kind of marked the beginning for me of the end with Windows. I noticed they were going in a, I'm not really sure how to put it, but basically, if you had lower end hardware, Vista wasn't good. It would actually not work very well because of the GUI, which stands for Graphical User Interface. And now I've used 7. I have a copy of Windows 7 Ultimate laying around. I need it for a couple programs or whatnot. Now I have Windows 10 Enterprise Edition for those couple programs. But I don't use it as my main driver anymore. And I barely ever use it, if at all. The 1 or 2 times I need it, I have a copy of it laying around. But I almost never need it. But with Windows 7, I noticed the same thing I noticed with Vista. And that is, if you have low-end hardware, it does not work well because, I forget the GUI's name in Vista, but it carried over to 7. And so even though people really liked 7, I personally didn't because of that GUI was still there. So if you had lower-end hardware, it just wouldn't work. It just became more of a resource hog since XP. That, and you are restricted onto how powerful you can build your computer. They limit how much RAM you can put in it, how much of a powerful processor you can put in, and all this shit. And now I don't know if it started with Vista, but I noticed it in 7 as well as 10. If you want to use server hardware for your workstation, you are forced to pay an exorbitant amount of money, upwards to $300 if not more dollars, for a operating system, just because you wanted to use more powerful hardware. And that's one of the things I've always liked about Linux, is it doesn't give a shit how old or new your hardware is, so long as the hardware is compatible. There is some research you have to do when using Linux in that regard, but for the most part, if you're using server hardware as your workstation, it's really not that difficult. Whereas with Windows, it's a nightmare. The only problem I've run into with using newer hardware, because I have a, if I can find it, I have a Wi-Fi 6 card in this. Is this it? I don't know. Yeah, I think this is it. I have an Intel Wi-Fi 6 card in this. Because it's a Dell, you can do that. They don't give a shit. But in order to get it to work, I have to have one of the latest kernels. So aside from that factor, I don't really have a problem using Linux. It's just a matter of making sure the Ethernet works so I can plug it in hardlined and update the kernel. But other than that, there's really no downside to using Linux if you want to, do some video editing, or maybe you want to use Blender. You can do graphic design. That's basically like Lightroom from what you call Adobe. I got Inkscape, Krita, and all this shit. I don't use this software very much. I'm trying to get into it, but I need some hardware for it, and this laptop will not handle it, unfortunately. But I have it installed anyways. I like pushing this laptop until it dies. That's how I use my hardware for at least 5 to 10 years, and I push it until it dies. Which is the way you should use your hardware, in my opinion. But I have, Minesweeper clone here, which I suck at. Solitaire. Things you'd have on Windows 95. But overall, Linux is and has been a very great operating system for me. And I think more people should use it. Especially now that Windows has become what it hated. And what I mean by that is there was a time when Windows told you not to download copies of its operating system from certain sites because they were known as cracked operating systems, and hackers would put spyware and keyloggers and all this shit in it. And now if you look at Windows 10, there's keyloggers and spyware and all this shit in it built into the operating system by Microsoft. So what they were once warning you about in cracked operating system, they've gone and done themselves. And I think that's pretty fucking hypocritical, and I think it's pretty fucking stupid. And I don't like even using Windows at all, and I'm really debating for my secondary, because the software I need that I can't run on Windows, that I can't run on Linux, sorry, basically lets you take if you go on Amazon Kindle, there's a desktop app for Windows and Mac, and then there's a piece of software that accesses those files and lets you strip the DRM from your files so that way you can keep them. And that's the only reason why I still use ebooks, is because I can strip the DRM from them. Not a lot of people know that. What's really funny though is if you buy music from Amazon, it's all DRM free. So I don't know what the fuck's up with that. But I still need a secondary operating system, unfortunately, because there are still a couple things here and there, especially with video game controllers and shit, that you just can't do on Linux, unfortunately. So more than likely, I'm going to look into, first and foremost, a Hackintosh and how viable those are, because I don't want to go out and buy Apple hardware. I think their hardware sucks. But if I were to go to another operating system, it'd probably be Apple, unfortunately, because Windows just isn't good anymore. It's not worth it, and with the recent leak of the operating system source code of XP and Server 2003, it's not safe to use anymore in any regard. And thankfully, there's always Linux, but for the couple of things I can't do on Linux, I do need a second operating system. But for pretty much everything I do for my day-to-day, I can easily just use Linux. And I like the fact that I can customize it and make it the way I want it to look. Whereas I can't do that with Windows. Or Mac, for that matter. I don't know. I've never really used Mac. So I'm going to wrap the video end up here. But this is basically just a recap of the past 13 years of me using Linux and what I've had to put up with Windows. But mostly my experience with Linux. And until next time, I'll see you guys later.